Okay, so just quickly, green button. This green button, okay. So I just want to start out by thanking the Office of Research Integrity as well as the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation and UC San Diego for supporting the work that we've been doing for the past 15 years to develop research ethics education, really targeting novice researchers. So where we've been talking about expert training, the city training, we've really dialed in on looking at lay research staff in particular. The objectives of my talk is to talk about how we've gone through several phases of developing an ethics education program for people who are involved in research who have no academic research training but have an incredibly critical role in implementing research studies in community settings primarily. So we've been, at the Brazil meeting, I talked about the formative research that we did, and we've taken a very participatory approach where we've involved the end users of our curriculum in the process of designing it. And then we have used their feedback to not only design the course, but to iterate and to test it. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how we've gone about testing it and, more importantly, how we're taking our findings and putting them into practice. So my first question for you, when you think about what a researcher looks like, you have something in your mind, and most people will think about a lab setting, a researcher in an academic setting. And the people that we're working with look like this. So they're community health workers. In Southern California, we use the term promotora, and they are promoters of health. And oftentimes they work in healthcare delivery, but more often, and I'm going to say over the past 40 years, have been really integral in facilitating community and clinic-based research studies. So one of the things that the promotoras have in common is that they are members of the community, they understand the traditions of the community, they speak the language of the community, and they basically share experiences with the community that they serve. And so they've been really instrumental in bridging a divide between academic research and communities that are really where health disparities are prevalent. And so they play a critical role in bridging that gap. And so one of the questions that we had several years ago when we started this project, which was basically to take a course that we had developed with funding from the National Institutes of Health and a program that we had developed with funding from ORI, and we put them together, and we wanted to get some feedback on what kind of skills and knowledge do the research promotoras need to carry out their work, how should we assess the competencies, and does our BRIC training, which is building research integrity and capacity, improve their learning about research when compared to a control group? And so the BRIC content, and again, this was informed through formative research by talking to PIs, talking to program managers, and talking to promotoras about what they needed to know and what they needed to carry out their work. And so this is basically our table of contents that is now in a book that is in both English and Spanish. And so this is available and can be used by people in the field. It can be a self-study guide, so there's a couple options for how people can access the content. So for educational research, and anytime we've developed a module, we always have learning objectives that we anchor to our content. And then we develop assessment questions that map to these learning objectives. So I didn't put those up there for you to read every single one. I just wanted to demonstrate for you that for all of our learning objectives, we map those carefully to our content, so that when we get feedback, actually, test results that tell us that there is no learning or there is increased learning, we can map it back directly to a learning objective and look at our content that's designed to address that learning objective. And so this is just an example of content that we have created so that you can get a sense of the visual appeal of it. But this is a random assignment, And so we show people visually what that looks like. We use words to show them what it looks like. And we also have narrated PowerPoints so that they not only can see it, but they can hear what the information is that we're putting out. So what we did with our RCT, and I have to say that, you know, working in community settings is really challenging and it can be very messy. It took us quite a bit of time to recruit participants. It was really interesting. We were recruiting promotores who were interested in research ethics and that spoke Spanish fluently because our course was delivered in Spanish. And we recruited, I think, 103 people and ended up being able to randomly assign 44 people. 24 went into our brick arm and 20 went into the control group. And what was really interesting is that we were able to explain the random assignment to the people who were in our study who were learning about what it was like to be in a study because they were actually subjects in a study. And so we used that process to explain to them, you know, the design and all of these things. So we ended up creating questions, and this was a really labor-intensive process, and Mike Kalichman was really instrumental in helping us get these questions developed. We ended up with 73 items, and we had 3 items for each learning objective. And we had 12 true false, 47 multiple choice, 14 scenarios that were based on and contextualized to community-based research. And that was way too many questions, I can tell you that right now. The promotores are not used to reading. They had to go through each one of these questions. In some cases, their eyes were watering at the end of having to read these questions. So we've now reduced those to 25 questions, but at the point where we were doing this study, we had 73 items. We did a pre and post test. We randomly assigned to the control and to the experimental. We ended up with more research experienced promotores in our control group. So they started off with more correct questions. Even though we did a random assignment, they were a little bit more research savvy. But at the end, when we compared pre-test, post-test, and between groups, our BRIC course had resulted in 3.6 more correct answers. Now, that was statistically significant. I'm not the statistician on this, so I'm not going to go into that, but I'm more interested in how do we practically make sense of this? You know, what do we do with something that we know is effective, but now how do we get it out into the mainstream? So we're now working from moving into testing it into how do we disseminate and implement this research, get it out to the people that really actually need it. So we're moving into a dissemination and implementation phase right now, which is actually science-driven. So what we've done is I have an amazing group of students who are pretty much, for the most part, all first-generation Latino students. And one of my students went through and looked at all of the dissemination and implementation literature, all of the different models, and has selected a model that really is resonating with our BRIC program. The next thing that they did was looked through the NIH reporter database to identify all projects that are happening in the US and abroad that are using the Promotora model. And then we're doing some experiments with implementation. So this is the model that one of the students presented, and it's called the Knowledge Transfer Framework. And it talks about the process, the actors, the activities, and it goes through all of the different phases of why this model is going to be of best use. So we're not really looking at how to disseminate it. We will do that by sharing information with all of the people in the country and abroad that are using the Promotora model. But we're really interested in how people adopt it and whether or not they will choose to continue to use CITI, which is a really difficult type of training for the promotoras to take. Because it's really targeting academic researchers, the CITI course is really difficult. And what we've learned from the promotoras is when they do take the CITI course, they feel incompetent. They don't know why they don't know what they are doing, and they end up feeling like not able to do their job. And so what we're trying to do is really tailor our education to meet their needs. And we would like to see PIs opt for an educational program that's more tailored to the research staff than relying on a city program that may not resonate with their interests and their abilities. This is a map that one of my students put together based on the NIH Reporter database so that you can see globally the different countries where the Promotora model is being used. And if you click on each one of these dots, this is an interactive map. It shows you who the PI is, what they're doing, what kind of research it is, and who's funding it. So this has been a really cool project so that we can identify where we need to target our dissemination and outreach. And recently we've had, within the past year, 7 different organizations that have contacted us asking if they can use our program. And we've just given it to them, and they now are telling us how they're utilizing it. So we're using a model called the Sturman model. And what's interesting about implementation research is that when you give somebody something and you ask them to use it, you can't necessarily control how they do it. And so what we're asking them to do is take notes about what they've done, how they've used the curriculum, whether or not they've used it in order or whether they've taken certain modules out because they thought those were the only modules they needed. So we've been collecting that data through interviews with each one of the PIs and program managers to learn how and what's working, what's not working. And just in closing, I want to thank my team. I've got an amazing group of people who have been working with us for over 15 years, a lot of community partners, and we are just really proud of the work that we're doing. And if you want to learn more, you can go to our website. The course is available. We can send you a module so that you can get a sense of what the course is about, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Stephanie? Okay.
Sorry. Stephanie Bird. I'm wearing my not editor's hat, but rather the engineering, the many years of responsible conduct of research education hat. And I wanted to follow up both to congratulate you on the project that you're doing, Camille, with respect to involving the community and having an interactive involvement in developing the kind of education that's necessary for the community. But also I wanted to address the question that was raised by you earlier, Sonia, about what kinds of possibilities there are for institutions around the world that don't have the funding or the focus or the awareness of the need to develop courses in 2 ways. Early on, it's really for institutions or groups of individuals at institutions who are in departments. There are always departmental seminars and workshops and journal clubs and those kinds of things that can be used. And I wanted to make everyone aware of the Online Ethics Center that comes out of the National Academies, where they've gotten a lot of funding from the National Science Foundation to make available modules and materials and questions for problem sets and all kinds of useful materials that would be available universally to both complement the work that you're doing and to provide resources, including teaching and departmental resources for anyone who's at any institution in any kind of setting where they'd like to pursue responsible conduct of research.
Awesome. Okay. Any other? Yeah.
Is that a question back there?
Yep. Hi, Gerard Kelly, Cork Institute of Technology, Ireland. I guess mine is a more general question to the speakers there this morning. I think there's a presumption that the postgraduate students come spring fully formed into research programs, whereas in fact, let's say with most of the engineering postgraduates, they will have come through perhaps an ABET accredited program where there will be a significant emphasis on ethics and ethical behavior throughout their formation. So I'm wondering if maybe the agencies like NSF or NIH should start interacting more with the professional bodies representing the different disciplines to actually start this ethical training much younger than at the postgraduate level. I mean, we all know that children from a very young age, they're like sponges, they can absorb stuff. So what we need to do is introduce this much earlier than at the postgraduate level, where in fact most of the, I suppose, the mentality and the thought processes have already occurred.
I think that's a really great point. And just as an example, I have an undergraduate student who's a nanoengineering student who, after having spent 3 months working on our project, said, why is it I don't get any of this interaction or information in any of my classes as an engineering student? And so one of his projects right now is to go through the curriculum of the top 15 engineering schools to find out what do they offer to undergraduates. And most of it will be in response to ABET. But is it research ethics? And so he's looking at that right now. But one of the comments that we've gotten consistently from people who have reviewed our curriculum is, can you make it available to medical school students? Can you put it out and make it available for undergrads or high school students? So what we've written here is really accessible for people who are 6th to 8th grade reading level, who have never had any exposure to research ever. So I think that if we could get this material in a format where it's accessible, people will access it, but it may not be the same thing as a formal training in class.